How are you doing today?
I'm good. Hi, how are you?
I'm fine, thank you. It's a pleasure to have you with me today. You've been very busy together with us at this Michael Korea trial.
Yeah.
First of all, Satang Nabane, for those who don't know, our scholar in the US, Satang Nabane, and one of the leading constitutional writers as well. Not just in Gambia, in across the continent. You've written, I've seen some of your publications, South Africa, and even here in the United States. So first of all, just wanted to welcome you to the show, because I usually have a show, straight talk show, and we're
Okay.
going to air this on that program as well.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's a pleasure. And Satang is a member of the diaspora, so today we're going to talk about two things.
Right.
We're going to talk about the diaspora, the rights of the diaspora to vote, which is a legal issue that has had a lot of prominence of late because National Assembly were debating this electoral elections bill, which should have included or had some clauses for the diaspora. But unfortunately, National Assembly members decided to remove one of the clauses, clause 14, which pretty much mandated the IEC
Right.
to register Gambians abroad and also to ensure that they can vote. Um, you're a member of the diaspora. You've lived most of your life in the country, but you now live abroad. Well known as a scholar in constitutional matters and legal matters. Seeing National Assembly members remove that clause, how did you feel as a member of the diaspora? First of all, as an individual, we'll come to the scholarly issue later.
I mean, yeah, thank you. Thank you for having me in, and my opinions about things happening, including the issue about the diaspora voting. I mean, I think it wouldn't be a surprise, obviously, if I express disappointment. I mean, I have written about this. We've been in several engagements, including, I'm sure we can talk about that, including with the National Assembly in terms of spelling out, with Professor Files meeting with regard to the sort of the evidence and the data that is relevant for determining, for instance, the demarcations and things like that. But we can come back to that. But I think on an individual basis, as I guess as part of the diaspora, I mean, and also given my, as you rightly said, given my constitutional law background and the fact that the Supreme Court, right, has reaffirmed that right, disappointment, obviously, is an understatement in that sense, right? Gambians in the diaspora, very similar to Gambians within the country, are all Gambians, right?
Yes,
It's just the fact that we live in different geographical locations.
Exactly.
And, when you also look at our immediate neighbors like Senegal, I mean, yesterday when I left the court proceedings, heading back to Boulder, my Uber driver, actually very randomly and coincidentally, was Senegalese, right? Or Senegalese, right? And so we started, having a conversation in all of it because the name sounded familiar. I was like, where you from? He said, Senegal. I'm like, Gambian. We kicked it. But I think part of the conversation, especially even with the Senegalese views and participation regard to the new government with PASTEF, but also regard to the fact that the diaspora is able to directly participate in choosing the government, came out of the conversation. And this is an Uber driver who obviously doesn't have a constitutional law background, right? So I think it speaks to this idea that the Gambian diaspora are, quote unquote, what we call audit, right? That where our the money that we send, the expertise, I mean, some of us probably is not money, but the expertise that we contribute and the knowledge production that we contribute on Gambia, right, is as good as until it's like time to vote, right? So I think in essence, and obviously we know that hundreds of diaspora folks, obviously the revenants that they sent, I mean, recently we had the conference back in January, which indicated the estimated amount that's been contributed by Gambians in the diaspora, right? So I think the crux of the problem is Gambians in the diaspora, obviously with the removal of the clause and in effect our right to vote being obstructed, right, is really saying that you're Gambians when you're contributing something, but when it's time to vote in,
We're happy to take the
you
money.
know, you
and all the good things.
you're not Gambian enough, right? You're not Gambian enough, and I think that is problematic, both on an individual level and given the type of work that I do with regard to the legal framework and our constitution as well.
Talking about the type of work you do, you were also chairing one meeting
Yes.
with the Diaspora MSDG,
Yes.
Which you've referenced to. I'm
Right.
also a fellow, just
Right.
for people for disclaimers
Yes,
here.
absolutely. We're both fellows,
I'm
so
a fellow,
yes.
so as well. So, but you were chairing this meeting, and the National Assembly members were there, members of that committee.
Right.
And you were discussing about the laws, the required changes, the legal changes that they needed to, put through the laws. And actually there seemed to be quite a lot of support for it. I don't think I heard any objections at that stage. And but then now it seems like all that work which you've done, can you say it's reflected in what the proceedings of the National Assembly, considering that you did engage them directly?
Right. I mean, we were there the whole day.
So
Right.
all the hard work,
Yeah.
if I could put it, is it paying off or?
I don't know. I mean, that's a valid question, and shout out to the MSDG folks and Professor Fal. I mean, as a fellow, was supported in terms of expanding Law Hub Gambia, which, as folks know, is a research think tank, but really focuses on providing access to legal resources, whether that's jurisprudence or legislation and others as well. So I think, as you said, that for me that meeting was very eye-opening, right? But it also speaks to, I think, even this idea that dialogue with policymakers obviously is important, right? In terms of not just quote unquote having the PhD or the educated folks talking to the people making the laws on the ground, right? I think that was really the essence of the meeting, right? And I think more than that, it was this idea of what valid questions do you have that we can answer, right? And I do think that's where what was really unique about the meeting, right? Because the work that has been done by MSDG and others in terms of collecting the data, because I mean the question about data, where are Gambians,
Yes,
was a
that was
major
a big
question, right? During the conversation or during the meeting, right? And they were able to show through the fact that it was rigorous methodology, right? Obviously, as academics, we make sure that we have multiple data sources that sort of verifies the information that we're given, right? Not to bore people, obviously. And so part of that meeting was really in terms of outlining that, but also outlining at least the estimated number of Gambians in various diaspora communities, as well as also, in essence, also showcasing best practices from Senegal as well as others in terms of how have they approached diaspora voting, right?
Exactly.
Because I do think in terms of providing alternative to policymakers in the Gambia, I think it's always important. I mean, I attempted to do this both in writing, but also even in engagement when, we'll come to the Constitution, right? But when the 2020 Constitution was rejected, there was the provision around gender equality and then a private, legislative quarter, then the private bill was introduced. And so part of what I attempted to do was to showcase how the best practices, whether from other African countries, including Uganda and others, how have they approached the legislative quarter, right? Because I do think as academics, as people that do research, this is where we can come in, right? In terms of being able to deep dive into the existing scholarship, collect primary data if needed, and then share it with policymakers to say, this is it, right? You're supposed to, and in this particular case, the National Assembly is supposed to ensure that the diaspora votes, right? I mean, there is no question whether we have a right or not. I mean, that's, that's not a
It's
question.
just a case of how do you enable it?
Exactly,
Yes.
exactly. And so in terms of enabling that process, what that meeting was meant to do, right, is to provide that. Unfortunately, I mean, yes, the meeting was interesting and understatement, but let's not talk about that. But I think what was, as you rightly said, part of the observation was that the folks, the parliamentarians, the honorable parliamentarians that were in the room, right, were genuinely interested in the engagement and also appreciated the efforts in terms of dialogue and the provision of substantive and evidence-based information, right, to be able to enable the process of diaspora voting. Obviously, what we saw recently is a whole different story, right? And I mean, I'm not gonna call names obviously, but there were certain people in the meeting and seeing them in the media talking about the same thing that we talked about during that meeting.
Yes.
Obviously, they had a different quote-unquote position at then. I think it's surprising, but also obviously frustrating and disappointing, right? I think part of it is calling into question, especially for, you know, researchers like myself and academics, what more should we be doing and how should we be rethinking about our approach with policymakers, because this is not just about diaspora voting, right? It has to, because I mean, in essence, with our transition, we do have a, you know, an ambitious transitional justice project, right? That is in essence also calling for the overhaul of, you know, quote unquote, our legal, not our legal system in that sense, but mostly the draconian laws that we have in place. I mean, recently we had, you know, the criminal offenses bill as well as the procedure pass, right? That is just one small step, right? No. But I'm saying, right? But I'm saying that there are things that are happening that academics and researchers like myself can be engaged in, right? But also, how do we make sure that we take it out of the elite space in a way that speaks to one, both the everyday Gambian, but also most importantly, obviously, the National Assembly members here as well. So I mean, I know this is a long-winded, you know, answer to the question, but I think the results obviously are disappointing. But it also calls on us as well, perhaps to go back to the drawing board in terms of rethinking about both in terms of approach as well as how we perhaps engage policymakers.
Maybe areas to improve. And so
I mean,
let's take stock. I mean, nobody's perfect. It was a good effort, but I mean, maybe continuous engagement perhaps could have been one of the things.
Yeah, and I mean, and this is not just the policymaker stuff and not just the diaspora, but I think in essence, different actors within the Gambian context should really be open to this idea, right, of critical self-reflection. I mean, we do good things, we do it once, twice, we pause it, we move on, right? But I think part of really looking at this transitional justice project, right, including whether that's the constitutional replacement project, you know, the work of the TRRC as well as beyond, and, you know, replacing the draconian laws, is to look at it as an iterative process, right? Really look at it, as we just said, in terms of it being a learning process where, you know, we learn, we go backwards and forward and take the things that we learn and refine the process, right? It doesn't have to be that it's set on stone, right? We could refine our approach and our ways of thinking.
And that's how people get better.
Yeah.